This is Luke Broyles with 21st Century Finance, and today I want to cover a very difficult topic for most people because this is far out into the future, or at least the mid-future, and it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it. But I think once it's fully appreciated, it will be worth your time. So I hope to make this video as fulfilling as possible. And today's topic is asteroid mining, and along with Bitcoin, and why these two things are intricately connected here. So they're very entwined, and so we're going to get right into it here, first by addressing asteroid mining and then coming back full circle to Bitcoin. Now, I know a lot of people think it sounds crazy. When I mention it to most people, their first reaction is to laugh, but the main point of this video is to say asteroid mining is not nearly as absurd as it sounds. Let's keep in mind here what is now possible. First of all, getting to orbit. That is a very difficult thing for humans to do. For thousands of years, we were never able to get to orbit. And then, of course, finally in the 20th century, we were able to do that. There is a massive gravity well with the Earth, and it's incredibly expensive to get to orbit. And we have successfully done that. We've done that for the majority of a century now. We now have reusable rockets, especially with the advent of capitalist rocket enterprises now, where it's not just in the public sector but also the private sector. We have massive achievements. This is one of my favorite clips of reusable rockets, and if you've not seen the SpaceX landings of Falcon Heavy boosters, it's really something to watch. Let's take a quick look at this.
Coming up in about 5 seconds here, the side boosters landing burn will begin as well.
That is pretty cool that these things are now possible that we can land rockets in reusing. That's a pretty big step, not just so we can get to orbit, but that we can get the rockets back. And it's also becoming economically viable. We have Starlink that is occurring. We have commercial space flight for individuals. Granted, it is extremely expensive. However, that's how all new technologies begin. Take the smartphone, for example, take the personal computer. All these things are extremely expensive at one time or another, and that is the path to make it more economically viable for mass scaling of production. 3D printing is also now possible, which I'll get to that more in just a moment, why that's important. We have visited asteroids with probes. This is something that now has been done in both the private and the public sector, I believe, but at least a couple times by NASA here. This is a pretty good clip of what that looks like, or at least a CGI rendering of what that looks like.
After landing on the asteroid, it spent 500 days mapping the surface. The probe also researched its inner structure. The data showed how different pockets of warm air on the surface influenced Bennu's flight path. This was vital information in case the asteroid ever threatened to crash into Earth. A robotic arm was designed especially for the probe. It was installed in October 2020. Last year, the probe edged close enough to Bennu to allow the arm to be shot a half-meter into the asteroid's surface. Pressurized nitrogen gas was set free. Enough matter was shaken up that the probe was able to catch pebbles and dust. After churning up the material, it was vacuumed up by the spacecraft's getaway thruster. The robotic arm placed this collection in a special capsule. Then in April, the probe sent photos documenting the location of the sample collection.
So this kind of thing, even though it's still a ways away, it's getting closer and closer. Now, not only do we have rockets so we can get into orbit, but we can send manless autonomous probes and drones to asteroids. Covering the distance and making it possible is the largest hurdle to overcome. We also have solar panels and other forms of electricity generation and production that can occur in space. And like I said, we can do this autonomously without human oversight. We can do it here from Earth. Now, why on Earth would people want to mine asteroids? We have plenty of materials here on Earth, right? Well, comparing to Earth ore, asteroid ore can be up to 50 times more concentrated in given metals. Here on Earth we have soil, we have dirt, we have debris, we have other materials. But if we're looking for really concentrated heavy metals, asteroids are some of the best places in the entire solar system. Granted, planets like, say, the Mercury or other moons, like, say, our moon or moons of Jupiter or Saturn, are also very rich in materials of this sort, but asteroids, compared to these other bodies, have virtually no gravity, which makes it extremely easy for departing the asteroid and returning to Earth compared to other celestial bodies. Also, there's no environmental damage. Here on Earth, as mining concerns continue, we destroy our own forests and destroy our own planet with emissions, and even more importantly, deforestation and destroying natural habitats that are very, very difficult to replicate. This is one benefit of asteroid mining, that there are no living organisms on asteroids to be concerned about destroying. Also, it's mostly autonomous in that you don't have to have a large amount of human oversight once the missions are out in space. And eventually, it will become cheaper. And that's a lot of what we're going to focus on in this video. And really, the only things that make asteroid mining implausible is that it's not economically viable yet. It is nowhere near cheap enough in order to mine to make the trip worthwhile. It's nowhere near cheap enough by like a factor of 100 to 1,000. And likewise, not only is it not viable to do it once or twice, it's not viable to scale to an absurd degree. So even if we were able to have one mining mission, that doesn't necessarily mean that we could scale it repeatedly to have a global system that's backed by that. However, we are on a trend that is remarkable. Comparing 1980 versus today, or the early 2020s, roughly 40 years later, the cost of launching 1 kilogram of space is down by roughly 1,000. Roughly 100, from 100,000 to 1,000. It's decreased by a factor of 100, the cost to launch material to space in just the last 40 years alone. And if this trend continues, and it looks like it might even be increasing in speed with the advent of privatization of rockets and space travel, by another 40 years from now, say in 2060 or so, it might go down by a factor of 1,000. Just from, say, $1,000 to $1. Maybe it's $5, maybe it's $10. But no matter what eventually happens, but no matter what kinds of technologies we discover, this is really where it gets unpredictable. But if the trend continues, the degree of cheapening of these kinds of transportation is only going to be more dramatic in the future than the kinds of advancements we've seen thus far in all of rocketry. And so we don't know exactly when this is going to happen. Perhaps it's 2040, perhaps it's 2090, perhaps it's 2100 is even too optimistic. But at some point in the next century or so, it is almost certain that these things become cheap enough that they do become economically viable. And if they do become economically viable, then the ability to scale production might occur. So how could it look? Well, the first step obviously would be to send the probe, which is the difficult part, getting it up to space. And then we would have to slow the asteroid in some degree, perhaps with lasers or thrusters have both been proposed in changing the direction of the asteroid. I know lasers might sound crazy to us here on Earth, but out in space, when you have a long period of time, even with a small amount of light, you're able to move massive bodies, surprising amounts. It's actually quite amazing if you learn the physics about it. Third, theoretically, we could use sunlight or mirrors to boil the surface. We can use the immense energy from the sun and just concentrate it in very high degrees towards the surface, get rid of water and ice and other materials that are not desired, and instead focus on materials we do want. And then capsules could be 3D printed to return and sent back to Earth, and then those capsules could just be dropped in the ocean, which is a very easy part of the process. And then, again, the difficult part is repeating that to where it becomes viable over long periods of time. Perhaps another economic model would be just to push an asteroid closer to Earth, say roughly a distance of the moon or 250,000 miles. And even if we find an asteroid that is not a threat to the Earth that would burn up in our own atmosphere, even if we just find a small asteroid to this extent, it could potentially be significantly cheaper than going out to deep space and provide an immense amount of materials that we can barely even fathom today. And so, as I said, all that's left is economic viability. But once we achieve that, it should be relatively quick, and that as we acquire cheaper materials from space, from here on Earth, we make the mission possible. Once the mission is possible and we're able to find and mine and refine and bring back materials here to Earth that are even cheaper, we're able to create more missions and repeat that over time. And given our history, given the last few thousand years of technological advancement, it's more of a matter than when than if we're going to be able to do this. I mean, if we look at energy consumption for the last 200 years alone, it frankly would be completely mind-blowing a mere 200 years ago in 1800 how much energy we use. You know, keep in mind, back in this time, just 220 years ago, almost all energy was biomass, you know, wood, fuel, and other sorts like that. The whole idea of coal would have been a foreign concept. Oil would have been a foreign concept. Gas, nuclear, hydropower, wind, solar, other renewables, and biofuels, all of these technologies not only would have been inconceivable for these people, but to imagine that all of these, we'd be using this much of them all at the same time, and on the things we use them on would just be mind-blowing. Or even 100 years ago, to think that we would use, say, 5 times as much coal as we do now than 500 years ago, and that's not even our primary source of energy or the majority source of energy, would have been mind-blowing. You know, or take oil. We use 100 times more oil today than we did, you know, just say 75, 80 years ago. You know, take gas or any of these other powers, and all of these are at the very beginning. We're at the very beginning of solar and wind and hydropower. And so as a general assumption, this is just going to continue as a function of time. If you were to compare 1800 from, say, 200 years before that, and 1600, it would also be an exponential curve. Granted, now that we're zoomed out to modern day, it looks like a significantly less steep curve, but if you were to zoom in just to this portion down here, this is still an exponential trend that has just been continuing, and there is no reason to think that it won't continue into the future. And this is one potential path. This idea of asteroid mining is one potential path forward.
So the reason it's so important is that in practical terms, the resources of the asteroids vastly outstrip the resources of planetary surfaces. Now, when you say that, a knowledgeable planetary scientist would say, yeah, but even the billions of asteroids that we know are in the solar system, they only mass about 4% the total mass of the moon. But the difference is they're not at the bottom of gravity wells, and many asteroids are undifferentiated objects, meaning that when you go to that asteroid, you don't have to dig around and find veins. If you find a metallic asteroid, it's all metal. If you find a carbonaceous chondritic primitive asteroid, you go there and it's got all the stuff that you need to make rocket propellant. So as humanity expands, harnessing those resources and then having them in space where the sun is so much more useful than it is here on the Earth from an energy perspective, makes it so it's the natural place to do manufacturing.
But even if we don't pursue that, there is still plenty of gold on here on Earth. To remind, we just discovered 31 million tons of gold ore in July of this year in Uganda, and that alone will have a pretty large implication on the gold market. Granted, it'll take a long time to hit the market, but that is going to happen, and we will continue to find more and more over time. So, like I said, we can laugh at this all we want. We can think it's absurd of sending space probes out to space and basically blowing up asteroids and sending back materials we want to land in oceans without any human oversight and basically running entirely on artificial intelligence. We can think that's absurd, but I would just encourage you to keep in mind that in 1780, the idea of a global network of iron and steel, like tubes of transportation, it sounds absurd. The idea of, tubes in the sky and planes and subways and automobiles, all of this sounds completely absurd in 1780, and yet we're barely 240 years past this date. The idea of glass bulbs with tungsten and all these materials to make these glass bulbs that were incredibly expensive at the time sound completely preposterous to them. And yet today, not even 200 years later, we have them anywhere. Light bulbs are stupid cheap. They're stupid cheap to run. You leave them on all the time. You don't even think about it twice. That's how prosperous we are today, and compared to this time. These people were killing whales to light their homes, and yet looking backwards, it sounds absurd, but looking forwards to today from this time, it looks equally as absurd. And if we think in our own lifetimes, in our parents' and grandparents' lifetimes, the idea of cell phones that have more computing power than all of NASA, when they landed people on the moon, the idea of that much computing power in your pocket on a smartphone with a touch screen, in many cases being cheaper than toilets. There are more people in the world that have cell phones than toilets. Okay, this kind of thinking would have sounded crazy to people in 1960, and that's within people's lifetimes. The idea of 90% of all heavy metals being mined off planet might sound crazy today in 2022, but we might be surprised how soon it is. Reusable rockets is already possible. Space probes getting there, capturing material, and bringing them back is already possible. The only thing left is finding a way to make both of these systems economically viable, and we're already pretty much there. So like I said, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but probably sooner than we expect. 144 years before we landed on the moon, the idea of a locomotive was deemed as absurd. And within that 144 years, we made the locomotive economically viable. We created the Transcontinental Railroad, and eventually we got to the point where we landed on the moon. And that's just 144 years, which granted is longer than a single lifetime. However, in a very short order of time, this is multiple transformational technologies that occur from step 1 to step 2. And so, even though this is probably not going to happen anytime soon, we'll probably see multiple layers of extreme change when we get from today to there. So what does this mean for the world? What does this mean? Well, a single asteroid can have an absurd amount of material. Granted, this asteroid Psyche has a ridiculous amount of materials. Very few asteroids have more than this single asteroid. But even if we take a relatively small asteroid and are able to take a very small portion of the material of the asteroid, the implications could be ginormous. To take some conservative assumptions, when compared to Psyche here, we'll take a very, very small asteroid. If we take one small asteroid and we assume that it has enough material to last 5 million years of current production, which I know that sounds absurd, but it is the math. If you look at how much material these asteroids have, they're extremely concentrated, they're extremely large, even the small ones. All it takes is 1/10,000th of mass of that asteroid brought back to Earth successfully for 5 years worth of supply. And that's not to say that's a specific prediction. This is just a hypothetical example. Even if it's only 1/10th or 100th or 1,000th of that amount, it's still a massive implication. But if we assume it's 1/10,000th of the mass of the asteroid, that's 5 years worth of supply. And so the first successful mission would dump 5 years worth of metal supply in the first mission alone, dump it onto the market immediately. And let's say 5 years after that first mission, we have a second mission, which is probably something conservative to assume. It probably wouldn't take 5 years for a second mission if the first one appears to be successful. But if we assume it takes 5 years for a second mission, that means that we have a fifth of a century's worth of new supply. The two trips. That's a 300% increase in supply issuance. That is ridiculous. And then after 5 years, if we do 5 more missions and then more and more, 10, 15, 25, etc., the math gets pretty crazy here. Within a mere 20 years or so, the first mission could have multiple decades worth of new supply every single year, just to have more and more numerous afterwards. It becomes cheaper and cheaper with new supplies. And what if each mission becomes 2x, 5x, or 10x more efficient? Like up here, what if the second mission is twice as efficient as the first mission, and we actually have double supply? We have 5 years from the typical mining, we have 5 years from the first mission, and double the efficiency the second mission. Let's say, this is kind of exponentials that create these kinds of parabolas that people in the past world can't really envision, and people of today, it seems pretty obvious here. And so if we go to the next slide, if we go to the next slide, it's all theoretical and anyone's guess, especially in the timing, but it's within the realm of physics, and it seems to be mere decades away from viability, maybe a century or so until mining on Earth becomes a minority share of what's left. But the larger implication here is that by the time the first mission has succeeded, it's already too late for metals as a store of value. And I really want to emphasize that here, that the market is always forward thinking. Let's say you're going to put the horse and a locomotive in the race. In a race with each other, and the vast majority of people have never seen a locomotive before, and everyone's placing bets on the train and on the horse, and nobody understands the train. As soon as everyone is able to see, as soon as the free market is able to tell that, oh, this locomotive is better than the horse, and I know that everyone else knows that, then there's no reason to hold bets on the horse, even if it's the very beginning of the adoption of the locomotive. From then on, everyone's going to be selling off the horse because they know it has no future. The market is forward-looking. even if we're only on the first or second mission and we're still years or perhaps a decade or multiple decades away from full implementation, no one's going to want to hold these things for long periods of time. Instead, the only people that will want to hold it left will be short-term speculators. So say, for example, we're roughly 130 years out, which in my view is relatively fair. It's like 144 years from pre-locomotive to first man on the moon. Let's say 130 years from now, 90% of minerals are mined off planet. That's a complete guess, by the way. Don't take this as any extensive research here. But if we say that that's the case, and we can assume that perhaps by the 2040s, early mid 2040s, we have the first mission, a very tiny, small, inefficient mission, roughly 40 years from today. That seems plausible and not entirely absurd. If that's the case, then we can assume that the 2050s to 2080s will be major changes in the metals market forever, because all the metal supply in the world can just be dumped on continuously, decades worth of supply every single year eventually. So the point's not to say that this is going to happen by any given date. These are all just arbitrary dates here. But the point is to say many metals that are currently store of values, say gold, silver, platinum, etc., all these markets might have mere decades left after thousands of years of dominance. Gold has been scarce in supply for the entirety of human history thus far. Granted, we find more and more gold every year, and we're getting more efficient at finding gold every year and refining it, and we're able to create roughly 2 to 3% of all the gold in the world every single year. It increases in that supply, but that might be over. We might have a parabolic increase in the total amount of gold towards the end of this century here. And even though it sounds crazy today, that has large implications because the market is forward-looking. When people buy gold, they hold it for decades at a time. And if at some point, say 10, 20 years from now, the average person begins to realize, wait a second, in a mere, say, 15 years from that future date, the supply of gold is going to increase by orders of magnitude, or an order of magnitude, that has a massive implication for the market. And people would reprice that to whatever the common understanding of that technology is. And so what says is possible inevitably, whether it's 10 years or 100 years from now, it's an endless decline to zero, because why would you hold gold as a store of value when its supply just increases exponentially as a function of time as we improve this technology? And it's important to mention that 4 of the top 40 assets in the world are metals. Gold is the largest single asset in the world. We have some megatech stocks up here, but then right below that we have silver. Gold is one of the largest assets in the world, and it has been for millennia. And we might be, again, take it with a grain of salt, but we might be less than a century away from this not being the case. And same thing with silver. If we scroll down here to palladium, by the way, Bitcoin's the 28th largest asset in the world, just about the same size as palladium. We have palladium and we have platinum, but the top 40, 4 of these assets are metals, and all 4 of these, along with the dozens of others of precious metals and all metals in the world, these might be on a fundamental change. And so the larger point is, what do you do? What do you buy? The machines can make anything. Eventually, sooner or later, we'll have the artificial intelligence, we'll have the robotics, we will have the ability to do these things, whether it's a millennia from now or a century or a decade from now. Eventually machines will be able to make anything. So what do you do? What do you buy in that world? Well, you need to own something that's finite, and we only have one finite asset in the entire world. We are on the verge of an infinite world. We are an increasingly infinite world as a function of time. And so what do you do in that world? Well, you have to own something that is finite. And in an infinite world, there are only 21 million Bitcoin, and that's why there's going to be an infinite amount of cash, an infinite amount of cash in the Federal Reserve, an infinite amount of assets divided by a finite amount of Bitcoin. And then you also have to keep in mind that you can't recreate Bitcoin. Plenty of people have tried to create Bitcoin or recreate Bitcoin, and all of them except the original Bitcoin has succeeded. You can't make more Bitcoin, you can't hack it and create more successfully. The more you try to destroy it, the more it fights you. This is the opposite of the honeypot problem. You can't corrupt it, you can't censor it, you can't stop it. People have tried, China has tried, plenty of other institutions, both private and public, and large and small, have all tried to stop Bitcoin, and none of them have succeeded. And even when Bitcoin was 100 times less secure and smaller than it is today, nobody has been able to do it. And Bitcoin is designed to last for the rest of history. 2009 to 2140 is the beginning. It's the proverbial gold rush of Bitcoin. This is when all 21 Bitcoins 21 million Bitcoins are issued. And after 2140, there are zero Bitcoins left. So this is really just the beginning of the monetary policy of Bitcoin. This is just the first incentive for the policy, and then after that, transaction fees. But there are only 4 million Bitcoin left, and that's really important to keep in mind. There's roughly 2.5 million Bitcoin left on exchanges. There's 1.5 million Bitcoin left to be mined. And let's assume of these 4 million, let's assume private companies amass a total of 3 million Bitcoin from their remaining supply and current holders. Keep in mind that this 3 million amount is in competition with all the governments of the world, all the individuals of the world, all the billionaires of the world. But let's assume they somehow get their hands on 3 million Bitcoin. Perhaps they offer prices high enough that they can get them out of private hands and hold them on their own balance sheets. So this is just complete guess. Now at this point, we're predicting decades out in the future. There's no way to know this, but it seems reasonable to me, especially when we consider that there's really going to ever be roughly 13 to 14 million Bitcoins because so many of them have been lost. Roughly 1/3 have been lost, but there's roughly 13 million. Half, it seems reasonable that roughly 1/4 of them are going to be in private companies or the hands of private companies. If we take that assumption and we consider the hundreds of millions of companies today, perhaps a future asteroid mining company has roughly 200 to 100 Bitcoin, maybe 1,000, maybe 10, but whatever the amount is, the larger point is that it's entirely possible in the future that you can buy the rights to an entire asteroid for what are today absurdly small amounts of Bitcoin. Maybe 1% of Bitcoin, maybe 1 Bitcoin, maybe 5 Bitcoin. I know that sounds absurd to people, and frankly it sounds strange for me to say. This entire statement, writing it out earlier, I just kind of laughed to myself because it sounds so absurd. But if you take these assumptions, it's a logical conclusion. If you assume that the world eventually converges on a dominant proof of work consensus model, the longest time chain is going to win, and that is Bitcoin by 14 years. There is no competition to it. And if we assume that, and we assume that asteroid mining is inevitable, and we assume that companies are going to hold Bitcoin as an asset on its balance sheet instead of cash or treasuries or other sorts of assets to be held like that, and that people are going to prefer holding that over company stock, which, if you understand Bitcoin, all these things become self-evident. If we assume that, then this is the only logical conclusion, that if these asteroid mining companies have relatively small amounts of Bitcoin by today's standards, again, you're dividing a single-digit amount of Bitcoin by triple-digit hundreds of millions of companies. This is not absurd. These would be considered large companies. Any company that would own more than a tenth of a Bitcoin or 1 Bitcoin would be considered a large company. And also, it's important to remember that most people have a lifetime earnings of roughly 50,000 sats, or which is roughly 5% of Bitcoin. So that's roughly, theoretically, what most people would earn in their lifetime. So, if we were to say that something, 10 or 100 times large in that, roughly 100 lifetimes worth of money, that seems something that's reasonable. And again, this is extremely theoretical, so take it with a massive asteroid size hunk of salt. But basically, the further out you go in time, the cheaper the mining of these asteroids become, and the more valuable the Bitcoin becomes, and so the more absurd this math becomes. Perhaps at one given point in time, it'll be 500 Bitcoin in order to get the rights for an asteroid, but then it'll be 10 times less, to 50, and then maybe eventually it's 5, and then maybe it's 1. The farther out you go in time, the smaller and smaller amount of Bitcoin it will take to purchase what today is astronomically absurd. And again, I'd encourage you to think of it in this regards. If you were to tell someone from 1800 that you could access literally any book in the world, and that there were going to be 10 times as many books in 200 years, they would say that's absurd. You can't have a library that everyone has access to instantly, where they can just give somebody a word and they can give you the name of that book. Well, that's what we have today with the internet. These things seem absurd looking forward, and looking backwards, they seem absurd that people ever doubted them. And so this still sounds insane that Bitcoin can go up forever and that we have these asteroid mining possibilities. I encourage you to refer to this metaphor. I've discussed this before. But basically, oxygen is the most valuable thing we have. Without it, we die in a matter of minutes. And yet, while nobody needs the Mona Lisa to survive, we all pay to see it. And this is not true of the Mona Lisa specifically. This is true of any finite thing, or at least finite art, a finite piece of art, not a finite collection of art. And if you price a finite system, a closed and thermodynamically sound system, and an open system, its price tends towards infinity here. And so obviously Bitcoin is the Mona Lisa metaphor when everything else is trending to oxygen over time. Gold is trending to oxygen. Silver is trending to oxygen. All these materials are trending to oxygen. It doesn't matter at the end of the day if we mine asteroids or we don't mine asteroids, even though I think it's probable given a correct amount of time, at a long enough period of time, one way or another, we will find a way to create more and more materials if it is required for the economy. If the price rises in these assets, it becomes more economically viable. You have a greater incentive to create more and more of the infinite thing compared to Bitcoin, where you can't make more of the thing. And likewise, Bitcoin is the first thermodynamically sound energy storage system in history outside human control or recreation. It doesn't matter how good our artificial intelligence is. It doesn't matter how good our drones are. It doesn't matter how many asteroids we can mine. Bitcoin is designed so that no matter how much energy you throw at it, it only makes the system more secure, and it only makes it less likely to be exploited. And if it was exploited, the longest time chain wins, it's dominant, and it continues on forever. So what does this mean for the market? Well, if this is the price of silver over the last roughly 100 years, first of all, I would like to note it's roughly the same price today as it was back in 1917. So, you're holding silver as a hedge against inflation. I'm sorry to be a bringer of bad news, but you have significantly better things to own than a piece of silver. But even though this isn't that optimistic for silver looking backwards, it's even more pessimistic looking forwards. And that's the point here, that eventually we will find ways on Earth and off Earth to recreate more silver supply, and this will only continue to trend down towards zero forever as we increase the amount of silver forever, and it becomes more and more like our metaphorical oxygen. The same thing with gold here. Granted, it has done significantly better than silver, and the reason for that is entirely because it has a more finite supply. It is easier to create silver than it is to create gold, and that's why gold has done significantly better. Today, it's anywhere from $1,600 to $2,000, depending on when you're watching, whereas at the same time period, 1970 here, it was roughly 5 times cheaper in the 2 to 3 to 400s here. So it's done significantly better than silver, purely because its abundance is lower. It is more scarce than silver. And so again, this begs the question, what happens when we find an asteroid and somebody has an economic incentive, whether they're mining it just to sell on the market, or they're mining it for chips in some futuristic computer or whatever, or some other purpose? What happens when we dump 10 years worth of silver on the market in a century or so? What happens when we dump 10 years worth of gold on the market every year in a century or two or so? All these materials have an infinite amount of supply. There's an endless amount of asteroids to mine. There's an endless amount of materials on Earth and in space to mine. And so it was just a matter of time until these thermodynamically unsecure ships sink and eventually go to zero. Even if it takes a century, you might as well buy a part of the ship that's going to survive and absorb all these sinking ships and all the passengers fleeing from these other ships. Because by the time someone realizes this, there's no point in holding anything else. If you realize, my ship of gold is going down, even though it's going down slower than, say, the US dollar or, say, treasuries, it's still going to zero. And so why would I own anything else? Because I know Bitcoin's here, I know it's here to stay, and I know it's designed to last. So, there's no point in holding anything else. Which, ironically, if people realize this, it might help kickstart the process and help. As metal prices come down, as people sell them off, it might make these kinds of missions out more economically viable, because all of a sudden, all the materials it takes to build the rockets and build the probes and build the computers that it takes to make these kinds of absurd ideas reality, people predicting the future and selling off these things might make it cheap enough that it becomes a feedback loop. There's no way to know this, but it seems entirely possible that this is kind of feedback loop we're looking at. We have first missions, people become more pessimistic on the price of holding these assets as a store of value, which makes them cheaper. More missions, more material dumped on the market, and et cetera, et cetera. That's the vicious feedback loop we have with any open or closed system. If you suck economic energy out of an open system and throw it into a closed system, all you do is rip open the tear in the open system, and you reinforce the inner strength of the closed system. And so the transition cost of this system adjustment will be very expensive because the reward is immense. We're going to watch thousands of years of history of these materials slowly and then suddenly decline over the next century, century and a half or so. And that's why Bitcoin is often called a black hole. It's a closed system. It's absorbing open systems. And the reason gold and silver are open systems is because there's no supply cap. The supply gap gets exponentially larger as a function of time. We have so much more gold today than we did 500 years ago. We had so much more gold 500 years ago than we did 1,000 years before that. And 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 500 years from now, we will have so much more gold, so much more of every metal on Earth that, frankly, it will, I'm sure, melt our minds today. And so what is Bitcoin going to do when it comes to these metals? Well, first of all, it's going to absorb the current market cap of these metals. That's the obvious first step. The total market cap of all these assets together, Bitcoin's going to absorb that. And then Bitcoin will absorb the future new supply of all these metals dumped on the market. And both these things have to happen before Bitcoin can absorb the off-planet mining. And again, that's going to last theoretically forever because Bitcoin isn't subject to energy loss in the same way as open systems are. And so even though, again, referring back to the 144 years between the locomotive and the first landing on the moon, you don't have to wait this entire time to see massive change or to see the beginning of massive change. Even though these ideas might be very, very long ways off in your lifetime, especially, that doesn't mean that change is that far away because inevitably step 2 has to be before step 3 and step 1 has to be before step 2. So step 1 very possibly could be far, far sooner step 2 because it simply has to be sooner. It's just a matter of when. And so when you consider that, first of all, Bitcoin is 95% or greater likely to become the dominant proof-of-work protocol forever, even if you think proof-of-work protocols are worthless, it is the dominant one, and it's almost certain to remain the dominant one because it's 14 years old. This is the Lindy effect. You can Google this yourself here, if I can spell that. But there are also thousands of attempts to create it, both before and after the creation of Bitcoin here. You also have... let's see, trying to do too much at once here. You also, just keep in mind, if we look backwards and we try to predict forwards, there's only one electric grid. You don't have competing electric grids. Granted, it's geographically isolated depending on the country or the region, but basically you have one electric grid. When you build a house, there's only one grid you're going to plug it into. Likewise with the internet. Even though the internet was incredibly young in the 1990s and 2000s, and most people weren't even using the internet, and many people couldn't even articulate what it was, there was only one dominant internet protocol, and it was far and above all the other attempts at the internet. Even if you try to create your own, even if you threw a bunch of funding at it, it simply won't survive. And the same thing is true with your Bitcoin. There's only one Bitcoin. If you recreated another Bitcoin today, it would not have the Lindy effect or the Metcalfe's law or the Gresham's law that Bitcoin is fulfilling. And again, the longest time chain wins. Once you understand proof of work, how proof of work works, and time chains, blockchains, and all that, you understand that the longest ledger work, the longest immutable time chain always wins. And so even if we create a superior Bitcoin to Bitcoin today, I am doubting that it would succeed. It would have to be orders of magnitude better in order to dethrone Bitcoin. And we have examples of this. All the hard forks, all other proof of work systems are dead by comparison. Ethereum has surrendered its proof of work system. Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Satoshi Vision are dead. They're 99% or greater declined against Bitcoin in Bitcoin's terms. Litecoin is another proof of work coin, and I know this will be a little controversial, but it is dead when comparison to Bitcoin. It is not appreciating against Bitcoin. There's no activity, there's no usage, there's no interest. And again, it's because the longest time chain wins. Bitcoin is older than Litecoin, and it is dominating it. And Litecoin is years ahead of any other competition that would enter the market today. And so if we take this assumption that Bitcoin is going to survive and become the dominant proof of work protocol, and we assume that asteroid mining seems to be inevitable, at least to me it seems inevitable, even though it sounds crazy, and we assume that, say there's roughly a 90% chance that it becomes economically viable at some point in the future. If we assume these two things, then these kinds of predictions make a lot more sense. If we keep in mind that Bitcoin's market cap today, roughly $300 to $400 billion, is 2.5% of that of gold. That's a 40x increase in the price of Bitcoin from roughly $15,000 at the time of filming. And also, don't forget, Bitcoin is not just coming for gold, it's coming for all metals. It's not just coming for metals, it's coming for bonds, it's coming for stocks, it's coming for real estate, it's coming for your cash, it's coming for everything. It may not take it all over, it may not completely destroy it, but it's going to eat away market share in all these assets once you understand Bitcoin. And to keep in mind that just gold, in just this first step here, is a 40x. You begin to realize that all these prices are cheap. $1 is cheap when Bitcoin was trading for $1. In 2011, when it crossed $1 for the first time, it was cheap. When it crossed $100, it was cheap. When it crossed $20,000, it was cheap. That's roughly what its price is today. First crossed that in 2017, and it is likewise roughly $20,000 in 2022, trading between 15 to 20K. $60,000 is cheap, or even more specifically, $69,000. It's previous all-time high in 2021. It is cheap. Doing too much again. I just can't talk and type at the same time. But $69,000 is cheap. 300 grand will be cheap. 2 million, 10 million, etc., etc. All these prices are cheap, and I know that seems expensive to us today, but that's because we're trying to price a future system within the current system. Even when Bitcoin is, say, as a complete guess, $50 million per coin, and only 3% of all metal production is off planet, so to speak, whether it's on the moon or the asteroid, however it's done, however fast it's done, it doesn't matter. When Bitcoin is at prices we can't conceive of today, because it has dominated the assets of today, it will still be cheap, because the vast majority of progress, the vast majority of materials and prosperity and energy to be brought to humanity is still ahead of us. And so even then, Bitcoin will be cheap. Granted, that's not cheap today, but in that future, when cash is 10 times more abundant and metals are 5 times more abundant, and on just beginning their exponential curve of off-planet mining production, it will still be cheap then. And like I said, people can't wrap their heads around these things, or when they even, when they do, they're viewed as insane or thinking way too out of the box. But to me, it seems entirely possible if we keep in mind that Bitcoin is very likely to be the dominant proof of work protocol, and if we keep in mind this is probably inevitable. And so if you're selling Bitcoin right now at $15,000 to $20,000 because you bought it 50K or 80K and you think it's cheap now, you're going to buy it cheaper or whatever, in my respectful opinion, you're a low conviction speculator with absolutely no clue of what you're buying. And my apologies. I don't know why you think you're going to be able to time this right or whatever. But if you're trying to time the market, if you're trying to buy the lowest possible you can, I would really encourage you not to, because $100,000 is easy. $300,000 is easy. $1 million is easy. The United States of America is going to add tens of trillions of dollars in the next 4 years alone of unfunded liabilities, and the market cap of Bitcoin is $300 billion. All it takes are a few large companies or one relatively large nation to start adopting a very small percentage allocation of Bitcoin, and all these prices and higher become extremely large. I know people think these prices are extremely expensive because Bitcoin started at an even lower price, but when you consider how Bitcoin how small it is today compared to where it's going to go, even if you discount asteroid mining, these prices become very easy. So my perspective, what should you do? Well, first of all, I think gold might be okay for the next few decades, especially with the debasement hedge. As the US dollar declines, as debasement continues, and money flows out of stocks with declining returns as well as bonds and cash, gold might be a pretty good hedge for inflation. I'm not saying you should sell gold. I'm not saying gold is immediately going to go to zero, but eventually it is going to go to zero. Gold, silver, platinum, copper, all these materials that are ample in amount and space, assuming technology improves and assuming it becomes economically viable in the relative mid-near future, roughly a century or so, these things are going to go to zero. And if, say, mass production of mining is a century out, they're probably going to trend towards zero significantly sooner than that as people start to catch the way that the tide is turning. Because by that point, keep in mind, people will understand Bitcoin. They'll understand that this is going to happen. Right now, people can't envision this world because they don't understand Bitcoin. But this world makes a lot more sense when you understand Bitcoin. And so even if all your models for the future you're trying to predict at, basically the last 4,000 years of history are irrelevant. Same thing with the horse. You might think the horse is a permanent staple of humanity just because for the last 4,000 years, from ancient Persia all the way out to cowboys in the western United States, you might think it's just going to be around forever. But if you're discounting the locomotive, you're going to be blindsided. And likewise, well, yes, gold has been a store of value for thousands of years. That very possibly might become irrelevant in the near future, and the replacement of that will be Bitcoin. And this is a good thing. It is a good thing when materials are more and more abundant. If we're going to go back to thinking about energy, our lives are objectively better, objectively more prosperous for everyone on Earth. In 1800, the global poverty rate was 80%. Today, it's barely even 10%. This is a good thing. And so gold prices coming down, along with all other materials, because of an infinite supply and infinitely increasing prosperity, is a good thing. And so already, even though it sounds absurd, gold is already only making sense as a Bitcoin hedge. Bitcoin has won. If proof of work chains, and if proof of work chains are the future, and if Bitcoin is the dominant proof of work chain, and it is a zero-sum game in which it absorbs all competitors because it's a thermodynamically sound black hole, then you realize there's no reason to hold anything else. All the other ships are going to zero. Everything else is trending to oxygen. Bitcoin is the Mona Lisa, and we're not going to be able to replicate it. If you double the supply of if you double the supply of the Mona Lisa, there's no addition. You've just created a replicate that's an inferior one that only magnifies the uniqueness of the first one. And this isn't even to mention the other downsides of gold. With gold, you can confiscate gold. The gold has been confiscated multiple times. Even in the freedom-loving United States of America, it's confiscated multiple times where it's illegal to transact. And the difference with Bitcoin is that even if it is illegal, it is extremely easy to bypass. Whereas with gold, it's very difficult because it's analog, where compared to Bitcoin being digital, which also has the problem of centralization. When you have an analog metal in the real world, like say gold, you have to have centralized authorities, banks and vaults and safes that can store the gold, which number one is very expensive over time, which takes away all the upside of the gold. And second of all, if you don't have your own personal custody, instead you trust custody to these centralized entities, then they can create just as much paper gold as they want. Say for every dollar of gold, they can create $10, $20, $50, $100 of paper gold that can be traded and speculated with on the market. And again, keep in mind that forward-thinking mindset. People that buy gold and hold it are holding it for extremely long periods of time. They're holding it for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If the average large institutional investor is holding gold with a 30-year time horizon, what happens when in, say, 20, 25, 30, 40 years, asteroid mining becomes a legitimate possibility? Do you think that they're going to be comfortable holding this asset, knowing that in a matter of 25 to 30 years, within their own time horizon, the market is going to be dumped on by decades worth of supply? And it's also important to keep in mind, Bitcoin has at least 100x upside compared with gold with less risk. And I would argue this is significantly more than 100x upside. But even if it's only a 10x upside, I don't think gold has that upside. Maybe it does in nominal terms, maybe in real terms, but I don't think so. Bitcoin has significantly higher upside, where gold has much more downside, at least in my opinion, because it has the risk of confiscation and it has the risk of going to zero as we mine more and more gold, where you can't do that with a finite supply here. So basically, Bitcoin is designed to be perpetual long on humanity. You know how you can short or long a stock. Basically, when you buy Bitcoin, you are an optimist. I know people typically think that Bitcoins are pessimists because we always talk about bonds and cash and political systems in a negative light, but at the heart of it, Bitcoin is designed to be a long on humanity. It's designed to be an optimist's investment. If you think that humanity is going to concentrate on a proof of work chain that relies on productivity and electrical cost instead of abstract authority, power, and political currency units, which is a good thing for humanity, then that answer is Bitcoin. If you think that humanity is going to get to the point where we increase our energy production by a factor of 3, 5, 10, and 20 into the future, then Bitcoin is the answer. If you think we'll eventually get to the point where asteroid mining is possible, then Bitcoin is the answer. You can't have a society that's operating asteroid mining, while at the same time having a person come out every few weeks or every few months and dictate the new price of money. You can't operate a society that has space projects that take years or decades to complete, where the monetary policy of that society changes every few weeks. It's completely absurd. It will be laughed upon. You need a technologically native currency that is disinflationary in nature, that its monetary policy is never changing. You can't have a spacefaring civilization where you have to have a monetary policy that is stable over extremely long periods of time if you're going to attempt to do anything off planet, even if it's completely autonomous. Like asteroid mining, it's going to be comical that people ever thought Bitcoin couldn't succeed. And so in the same way that Bitcoin is a perpetual long on humanity, in an optimistic perspective, gold is a perpetual short on innovative tech. If you are buying gold and holding it for an extremely long period of time, you are betting that we are not going to have improved technology, because if we have improved technology, we'll only get better and better at refining gold and mining gold. And so if you're buying gold, that's inherently what you're doing. You're betting that technological progress is going to stop. I know that's not how it feels, and I don't mean to pick on gold bugs here. In fact, I have a lot more in common with the gold bugs than disagreement with them, but that's basically what you're doing. You are fighting an exponential curve of innovative tech. And if you buy bonds, you're even more pessimistic than Bitcoin and gold holders, because it's perpetual short on sound mathematics. Not only when you own bonds are you fighting against the exponential trend of technology, which is an open system, but you're also fighting the even more exponential trend of unsound mathematics, and how we have to have an increasing amount of currency supply. So not only are you fighting tech, you're also fighting basic logic and basic math that we can't afford creating money out of we can't afford creating money out of thin air. And so in my opinion, even though gold might be okay for the mid future here, at least until we discover more efficient ways of mining gold, whether it's on planet or off planet, in my opinion, I would sell gold in all metals, because basically they're going to zero with everything else, and Bitcoin is going up forever, assuming humanity continues to survive. So I would sell gold, I would sell metals, I would buy Bitcoin, and I would hold it forever. And even if I think this is crazy, and even if I think that it's incredibly unlikely, having a 0% allocation after considering these things, to me, is just insane, in my opinion. I see no reason to think that 0% allocation to Bitcoin is logical in any sense. I used to have a 0% allocation, and I was really sure that Bitcoin's a scam. I thought it was a speculation. I thought there's no future for it. But now I'm more educated, and I understand the technology. I understand it's going to work. And I'm not 100% confident in Bitcoin, but I have a high enough degree of confidence that I'm willing to undergo these massive price swings and make these videos and talk to a large number of people about it. And so if you're listening to a skeptic go from a full-on skeptic to a full-on believer, I encourage you to get off zero at the very least. You might think it's absurd. You might be trying to evaluate the Bitcoin system within the current system, and these high prices and asteroid mining and infinite assets and all these other ideas might seem completely absurd, but my encouragement is just to expand your time horizon. So many people are focused on the day-to-day events of the news and interest rates and this and that and the other, and I just encourage you, focus on technology. That's the important part with economics and understanding economic trends. If you understand, you can have all the models of a horse that you want. You can be the most educated person on the entire planet about how the horse has operated, the economics of the horse and the horse market and industry and horse breeding. You might know how to make the perfect stallion based on the last 4,000 years of history, but you are completely unprepared for a more efficient and more successful technological system. And that's basically what we're looking at here. You might think that Bitcoin's not a threat. You might think it's just a little corner of the internet. But my warning to you, my takeaway in all this, is that it might be significantly bigger than you realize, and that in just a mere 144 years, again, to use the locomotive as an example, we might go from this theoretical, absurd idea of a iron horse that travels over land to literally landing on the moon. So I encourage you, at the very least, start thinking different, start expanding your time horizon, and when it comes to Bitcoin, I'd encourage you to get off zero.